Very much, Thomas. Vice President, Minister, other distinguished participants, hopefully in Buka and Port Moresby, Director and members of the National Research Institute, members of the diplomatic community, and everyone else joining us virtually on this occasion. We're honoured to have the opportunity to speak today at the launch of our report on institution building in post-referendum Bougainville. As Thomas just mentioned, the report was commissioned by the National Research Institute of Papua New Guinea and it's co-authored by Dr. Dziedzic and myself. In the time available to us today, we'll outline the key points in the report and answer any questions you may have. And we'd also be very happy to answer questions later by email or Zoom once people have had time to look at the report more closely. Now, because the report raises a lot of issues, we thought it might be helpful to use PowerPoint. So just excuse me for a moment while I share my screen with you. I know PowerPoint's not the most friendly way of doing things, but hopefully this will make the report as accessible as possible. The terms of reference for the report asked us to identify the issues and options for building the institutions of government in post-referendum Bougainville. It was a difficult report to write because at least some of the institutions that Bougainville is likely to want or to need depend on decisions still to be made about the future relationship between Bougainville and PNG in the course of the consultations. Those decisions are the preserve of the governments, and we were very concerned not to preempt them in any way. So for that purpose, we've referred throughout the report to the ultimate goal as self-determination for Bougainville. We've used self-determination as a neutral term, capable of covering any relationship between Bougainville and PNG that establishes Bougainville as a self-governing polity in response to the referendum result. Now, many variations are possible for the relationship between Bougainville and PNG, but for the purposes of examining the issues raised by institution building, we needed to identify the main options, if only in broad terms. So to that end, the report identifies the three following broad options. One, self-determination for Bougainville outside PNG as an independent, formally sovereign state. Timor-Leste is an example. And this option would require acceptance by key international actors to recognize Bougainville as a sovereign state. The second broad option, self-determination for Bougainville outside PNG, but in a form of special relationship, or as it's sometimes called, free association with PNG. Cook Islands is an example, presently in free association with New Zealand. And the third option is self-determination in a form that establishes Bougainville as a self-governing polity formally within PNG. And Greenland is an example in its relationship with Denmark. Now, as each of those examples tells us, it's possible to move between those different options for a relationship with another country over time, unilaterally or by agreement. So, if it chose to do so, Greenland could move to free association with Denmark or full independence. Similarly, if it chose to do so, Cook Islands could seek international acceptance as an independent sovereign state. So this possibility of institutional change over time might be another useful device for the consulting parties to consider in Bougainville and PNG. We suggest in chapter 2 of the report that the important decisions to be made by the governments in the course of the consultations might be assisted by first agreeing on some key principles that could shape the outcome. As a starting point, we suggest 8 principles that occurred to us for consideration by the parties. We won't take you through them all now, But to give you 3 examples, they include the following. Principle 1, the dignity of the referendum vote should be expected. Principle 2, the ultimate goal is Bougainville as a self-governing polity that works effectively for its people. And a third principle, again, just by way of example, institutions should be tailored to fit the realities and preferences of Bougainville. Is that all right? Everything okay? So our report also has been informed by those kinds of principles. Now, before asking Dr. Dziedzic to outline the chapters of the report dealing with institutions, let me make some introductory remarks about those chapters. First introductory remark, we've interpreted the idea of institutions broadly to include not just offices and agencies, but whatever Bougainville needs to become a self-governing political community, including change to the Bougainville Constitution itself. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the slides there. And we note the importance of non-state institutions in Bougainville, but we don't cover them in the report. And we also do not cover questions about revenue, which are dealt with in the companion report that will be introduced shortly. Second introductory remark, most, although not all, of the institutions we cover would be relevant to Bougainville, whatever its future relationship with PNG. But some institutions would be more urgent or would take on a different character if Bougainville were an independent sovereign state. So let me give you an example, citizenship. If Bougainville were an independent sovereign state, it would need arrangements for Bougainville citizenship, and it would need facilities to issue passports. If Bougainville were to remain within PNG, it could have its own citizenship, but need not do so, and it would continue to use PNG passports. If Bougainville were in a form of free association with PNG, it could, but need not, retain PNG citizenship and continue to use PNG passports. So that's just a small example to show you how these institutions play out a little bit differently depending on the outcome of the consultations. Third introductory remark, the report covers not just the existence of institutions and Bougainville's autonomy in relation to its own institutions, but also the effectiveness of institutions in practice. That's an equally important issue. Fourth, the report notes that it's not necessary for Bougainville to operate all its own institutions in the short term or even over time. In the contemporary world, it's common for states to collaborate over some institutions in various ways. So to give you an example, not every state has its own currency. Kiribati, for example, uses the Australian dollar. Timor-Leste uses the US dollar, at least officially. As another example, some states use the apex courts of others as a final appeal court until they're ready to establish their own. So, for example, Nauru used the High Court of Australia for many years before that arrangement came to an end. And then the fifth and last introductory remark, for the purposes of planning and determining priorities, the report identifies 3 relevant time periods. One is the current transition phase, which is already underway and will continue until the consultations are complete. The second is what will be a planned transition phase to run from the end of the consultations to whatever period is agreed between the governments to give effect to the decisions about self-determination. And then there may be a third phase, which we've called in the report a post-transition phase, during which Bougainville could, if it chose, share governance arrangements with other states or Bougainville might, again, if it chose, move between different categories of self-determination. And it seems to us that those questions of timing can be used by PNG and Bougainville in many ways to support a really effective transition. So now we're going to move to the institutional chapters, and my colleague, Dr. Dziedzic, will introduce those. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. So as Cheryl said, I'm going to briefly outline the institutional chapters of the report, which run from chapters 3 to chapter 7. So chapter 3 considers the need to further develop Bougainville as a polity in conditions of self-determination. So this is the chapter that deals with citizenship, the issue that Cheryl described earlier. But this chapter also develops the point about the need for Bougainville to be a functioning political community that is cohesive and in which citizens trust and are able to rely on their public institutions. Chapter 4 deals with the Bougainville Constitution. So on any view, the Constitution will need to be changed, whether by altering the existing Constitution of 2004 or by creating a new one. The process by which this is done can be useful for strengthening the political community. So this chapter relates back to chapter 3. And a chart of the constitutional provisions that need to be reconsidered for the purposes of self-determination is attached to the report in Appendix 1. So the details of any change depend, of course, on the form of the relationship between Bougainville and Papua New Guinea, but they include at least the need to break the nexus with the Bougainville Peace Agreement. Chapter 5 deals with 3 sets of institutions, which we have called governance institutions, public sector institutions, and other institutions that perform a role in public life. And universities are an example of this third kind of institution. So Bougainville already has significant governance institutions, and these include the Presidency and the House of Representatives. Self-determination outside of Papua New Guinea, however, would require consideration of additional institutions, such as a head of state. And whatever form self-determination takes, Bougainville will need to take on more responsibility and perhaps complete responsibility for its own court system. If self-determination takes place outside of Papua New Guinea, Bougainville will need to make provision for an apex court, whether it establishes the court itself or it shares the court with another state. Okay, Bougainville already also has significant public sector institutions, the capability of which will become even more important under self-determination. There are various kind of gaps, however. So not all of the institutions for which the Bougainville Peace Agreement provided have yet been established in Bougainville. Bougainville does not have sole responsibility for all its existing institutions, and other new institutions may be required depending on decisions about the future relationship between Bougainville and Papua New Guinea. So institutions that require consideration for one or more of these reasons include the Ombudsman, a human rights body, the Land Board, ordinary police services, currency and associated financial institutions, and institutions for defence and external affairs. While the report identifies such institutions for consideration, this does not imply that Bougainville must have them all or that Bougainville must establish them all itself. These are questions for Bougainville. So for example, it's not necessary for Bougainville to have a defence force. And Bougainville could, if it wished to, continue to use the Papua New Guinea kina or another currency if it chose to do so. The institutional requirements for self-determination are considerable, and it will be up to the governments to determine priorities in the light of their assessment of resources and capabilities available. There is a synergy here with the report about revenues that will be introduced to you in a moment. One of the obvious priorities is to establish effective institutions that can realise the chosen revenue raising options. So chapter 6 deals with institutions relevant to Bougainville's relations with the outside world. And these will be necessary if Bougainville becomes an independent state outside of Papua New Guinea. And at least some of them will be required whatever form self-determination takes. So Chapter 6 groups these into 4 categories: international investment, international aid or other forms of assistance, international representation, including diplomatic representation in other states, and engagement with regional and international organisations, and external affairs more generally. So the final substantive chapter, Chapter 7, deals with institutions that would be helpful in managing Bougainville's relations with Papua New Guinea. It also notes the needs for amendments to Papua New Guinea's constitution to recognise Bougainville's new status. The details of these institutions and constitutional changes depend on decisions made in the course of the consultations about the future relationship between Bougainville and Papua New Guinea. The report is written, however, on the assumption that on any view, history, geography, and demography make a close relationship of some kind between Papua New Guinea and Bougainville inevitable, and so intergovernmental institutions will be very important. So I'll now pass back to Cheryl to sum up our presentation and make some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. We hope that's been a helpful overview of what's inevitably a somewhat complicated and detailed report. So in closing, can I just express both our thanks to the National Research Institute and in particular to Thomas Webster for all the support we've been given in the course of the project, and also to Martha for all her incredible technological help with the presentation today. This is now the second report we've written for the NRI, and it's been a pleasure working with them again. And our thanks also to Satish Chand, who's co-authored the companion report, for his collegiality during the project. And thanks to all of you for being with us for the launch of this report. And finally, we conclude by expressing our best wishes for the consultations when they take place. Bougainville and Papua New Guinea already can be proud of what they've achieved in and through the Bougainville Peace Agreement. This next phase of the process is both historic and important. We've been honoured to be able to play even this small preliminary supporting role, and we'll follow what happens next as closely as possible. If anyone has any questions at any stage about the issues canvassed in the report or other issues related to them, we'd be very pleased to assist further in any way we can. Thank you, Thomas. Back to you.